Okay. Yeah. So happy Friday to those that are working. I know weekend is always nice. Um so so let's overview of what we're going to do today. So today we'll cover lecture four. Um the material for lecture four is not too heavy because you'll notice that it relies a lot on your lecture two, right? So things that we cover in lecture two, as well as lecture three, which is the last lecture, where we talked about the DDM. Particularly, remember we discussed about no growth, stable growth, and the two-stage model. So what we're going to do is repeat that, but now with the free cash flow model, the residual income model, and last but not least, we'll just discuss a bit on this concept of EVA, right? So in terms of content, I think it's lighter, not too heavy compared to maybe the last lecture, because the last lecture was the first time we look at this um, two-stage model, etc. Right? So we might have some time at the end, and so I'll leave the end to answer any questions relating to your GBA, because I believe that many of you would have already started. And the submission is in 2 weeks' time, meaning that the next lecture we have, you have already submitted, right? So we'll try to use this lecture to answer any questions that you might have as you start preparing and doing your GPA, right? So that's the plan for today. All right. Before we start, any questions regarding the lecture material so far? I guess maybe not. All right, so let's kickstart the lecture, right? We'll jump straight to the lecture, and then we'll have some time at the end, and we can answer any questions, GBA or even the class test. Okay. All right. So lecture four. So lecture four would be the last lecture in terms of quantitative methods of valuation, right? So after this lecture, you are fully equipped to do your GBA. You can um, do your quantitative valuation for your company that you've chosen, right? So take this opportunity, I would say, to ask any questions, having hopefully having started really doing your GPA. So if you do have any questions, take this opportunity to ask them, and so we can discuss as a class together, right? Okay, so the FCFF. So FCFF, um, we have seen this valuation before, right? The FCFF in lecture two. So I just want to ask a question. Anyone recall what is the difference between the FCFF and FCFE? Okay, yeah, right. So FCFE, thank you. FCFE is only equity. FCFF includes debt and equity. You are totally right. So for the debt and equity, which is the FCFF, um, we need to add back your interest expense, right? Yes. So you're right. So FCFF is debt and equity. So you need to add back interest expense because these are cash flows to the debt holders. And so it doesn't make sense to remove these uh, cash flows, right, from the FCFF cash flows. So, so that's what we have discussed previously, right? For FCFE, on the other hand, then we have to remove the interest expense, cash flow, and also any cash flow relating to net debts, right? We will add back the net debt, but we'll look at this in more detail later. So that's the main difference, right? FCFF and FCFE. And so because FCFF is debt and equity, what we have discussed in lecture two is that in terms of discount rate, we are going to use the WACC, right? Because we are going to consider both the weighted average cost of capital, which is debt plus equity, in our calculation. of the firm value, where we value it using the FCFF, right? Okay. So in terms of this FCFF, we are going to cover in three parts, right? Similar to our DDM. First, we're going to talk about the single stage. And in our single stage, we have the no growth situation, the stable growth, and stable growth situation, right? And then in the second one will be the two-stage model. Now, for whatever I'm going to cover today, the FCFF, SCFE, residual income model, we're just going to stop at the simple two-stage model. We're not going to cover the H model. So H model, it is just for the DDM. However, if you go in Google and search, you can actually search the H model for FCFE, FCFF as well. The formulation is slightly different. However, for the purpose of this course, the H model for the free cash flow models and residual income models are not required, right? However, it's possible to use the H models as well, okay? In case you want to use it for your GPA. Now, for your MCFF, let's focus on this, right? We discussed a couple of interesting things when there was no growth, so meaning G is zero, then we simply use the present value of perpetuity, right? No, so it's just perpetual. G equals to zero, and you'll just keep growing. Sorry, not growing. So you'll just be a constant cash flow, right? So we just calculate the present value of the perpetuity of this cash flow. In lecture 2, we have also discussed this concept of, when we calculate FCFF, it basically gives us the firm value, right? And so if we have the market value of the debt, then we just take a firm value minus the market value gives you the equity value, right? In lecture 2, we also discussed this. And the reason why this works is because on the balance sheet of a company, the company is made up of equity and debt, right? So if we have the value of the company and we minus the value of the debt, then we get the value of the equity, right? Which is what is here. And so we'll see in the next few slides some examples where the question will ask you calculate the equity value using the FCFF formula. And so because of this, we need to use this formulation where the value of the firm is consisting of the value of equity plus the value of the debt. Now, then the question is, how do we calculate value of debt? So is the number of outstanding bonds times the market value of the bond, right? So this is, of course, assuming that all the debt of the company is in bonds. But we know that that's not the case, right? Most companies, there will be some level of bank loans and some level of bonds, right? And bank loans are not traded on the market, so they're not market value, right? I think in lecture 2, we kind of discussed this where the bank loans will therefore be book value, right? So, of course, in this framework of market value of debt, we are assuming that everything is in bonds, right? For simplicity. But when you do your GPA, you might notice that most companies, that's not the case, right? There'll be some bank loans and there are some bonds. Now, in terms of after doing that, we can calculate the equity value, but that's not all, right? Most of the time, when you look at questions, they want you to calculate the value per share. So then we just need to divide by number of shares outstanding, right? To calculate the share price or not share price, sorry, the value per share of the company. Okay, so these are just some important formulas that we have previously covered in lecture 2, but I just want to recap them for you, right, in the FCM. Okay. Right. So the second single stage model that we talk about is this thing called the stable growth, right? Stable growth meaning our G is some value, like let's say 5%, right? And in this case, we use the growing perpetuity formula where it's going to grow at perpetuity, let's say at 5%, right? Because stable growth is just going to be 5% forever, right? And we use the present value of growing perpetuity to determine the value of the firm. So those are the formulations that we have kind of talked about in our DDM already, right? Now, in our lecture 2, we have also seen this formulation. So let me just jump to lecture 2. Let me see. This one, FCFF. Yeah, here, right? So recall in lecture 2, we described this table, and we went into quite a bit of detail on what's operating cash flow, what's this NCS, and change in net working capital. But recall that in lecture 2, I mentioned, in terms of our operating cash flow, I will go into more detail on why is it that this formulation, I'm sorry, why is it that, let me see, how come I can't find my pen? Strange. Let me just go back. Sorry. Okay, never mind. I think we don't have a pen here. But how come in our operating cash flow, sometimes it's plus depreciation, sometimes it's depreciation plus depreciation times tax rate, right? So in this lecture, let's look at the proving of this. Sorry, not sure what's happening here. Okay, so so what we want to do here is that we want to ask, okay, how come for this case is depreciation? How come is depreciation time tax, right? So we just want to kind of understand the formula a little more. Starting from what the base formula here, right? The base formula is always the lowest where it's net income. So I have a question here. Since you start with net income, why do we need to add depreciation and why do we need to add interest expense? Okay, yes. Uh, yeah, you want to get back EBITDA, all right, okay. Um, but is there, yeah, you're right. So you'll get EBITDA, but is there a reason why depreciation is added back in terms of the cash flow? When you think about free cash flow to firm, okay, I do see that, yes. So I see some answers that depreciation is non-cash. So you're right. So depreciation is added back because it's kind of a non-cash item, right? And I see a comment. So the value of them includes debt holders and depreciation value. So the reason why interest expense is added back is what we discussed earlier, right? Because the FCFF, we are focusing on debt and equity holders. And so the interest expense shouldn't be removed from the cash flow, right? You must add it back because in our net income, you have already removed the interest expense. So now you have to add it back. If not, you'll not be correct, right? Because we're looking at the cash flows to both equity and debt holders. Okay. Um, so we're going to start with the base here, right? The net income formulation. We know why we add depreciation and we know why we add back interest expense, right? And then here we have our NCS and net change in working capital, which is everything in green and it can't repeat, right? Because that one is the if I flip back here is the two other components of our FCFF formula, right? Okay, so then we will discuss the derivation of this and this just for information so that you can come understand, oh, how do I actually get the EBITDA formula? Not necessarily to memorize the formulation, right? But what's interesting is this, right? There is another formulation which do not use the P&L or profit and loss statement numbers. Instead, what it uses is the cash flow statement of a company, right? And how it works is that we can use the operating cash flow of the company based on the cash flow statement, right? And then we add back interest expense, and we minus NCS. What you'll interestingly notice is that where is this net change in working capital, right? How come we do not minus net change in working capital here? So this is the so if you go to your cash flow statement in any companies, look at the cash flow statement and look at how they calculate cash flow from operations or uh, CFO. You'll notice that in the CFO, it has already minus net change in working capital. Right? This is something that they have already removed and is part of your operating cash flow in your cash flow statement. So, which is why here is missing. There's no need to adjust for the net change in net working capital again. Um, so you're right. So the direct and indirect method, there is a difference in terms of the presentation of the operating cash flow. However, there's not going to be difference in terms of the value of the operating cash flow. All right. All right. So there is another formulation, this formulation using the operating cash flow from the cash flow statement. So in case, when you see any questions pertaining to FCFF, and if they share with you, oh, I have a operating cash flow of what, straight away, hopefully you can think that, oh, once they mention there's an operating cash flow, then you should use the last formulation to calculate your FCFF formula, right? However, in most cases, you'll be using the first three formulations here based on the profit and loss statement of a company. So now let's jump into the formulation. So we have already explained the most basic form in the sense of the net income one, which is this. We have explained this already, right? So now I'm trying to prove to you how we get the EBIT formulation, right? So let's try to understand how it works. So this is purely for explanation only, right? So we know that net income equals to EBIT minus the interest expense, right? Minus the tax expense, which is 1 minus the tax rate, right? So this is the tax expense here. So you have your EBIT minus the interest expense minus the tax expense gives you your net income. Now, having done that, what we can do is to multiply EBIT into 1 minus tax and multiply negative interest expense into 1 minus tax here, right? And this is what we have gotten here, like this. Thereafter, I'm going to shift my interest expense minus interest expense times 1 minus tax to the left side of the equation, which is here, right? Thereafter, I'm going to add depreciation on both sides, as you can see here. And interestingly, what we see is that, hey, you know what? Actually, this looks like what we have formulated at the most basic form of formula, where it's using net income, right? It's given by here, which means that this component here is equivalent, right, to here. And so we have kind of proven the EBIT formulation, right? Just really to show you that both the net income formulation and the EBIT formulation gives you the same, is exactly the same, identical. Now, moving on to the EBITDA formulation, let's try to understand where we are coming from, right? So we have the EBIT, we start with EBIT again, and EBIT is basically just EBITDA minus depreciation, right? Amortization, we just take it as if it's depreciation, right? So we just ignore the amortization. Now, we multiply both sides by 1 minus tax rate, so we just do a multiplication. We add depreciation on both sides, so we just add the depreciation here. Now, what we do is we do a bit of expansion now, right? So we kind of multiply your EBITDA onto 1 minus tax rate, and we multiply the negative depreciation into 1 and negative depreciation into minus tax rate. right? Which gives you this, right? Minus depreciation plus depreciation times tax rate. And then this, you just bring it down here, right? Exactly the same. Okay, so now what we'll see is that we can actually do some simplification, right? Our net minus depreciation and plus depreciation can cancel out each other. They're kind of the same. Having done that, what we left is depreciation times tax rate. And so again, this EBIT formula becomes equivalent to this EBITDA formula here. And therefore, what you notice is that for the depreciation, there is depreciation times tax rate, right? And then for the EBIT, it's just depreciation. Okay. So we have three different formulations. And then maybe the question you are asking yourself is, okay, let's say I have a question, right? And then which formulation should I use? So generally, you can use any three because they give you the same answer. But the easiest way to do it is to see what they give you at the start, right? If they give you EBIT, use the EBIT formulation. If they give you net income, just use the net income formulation, right? That's the easier, the simplest way to do it. However, let's say in your GBA, you can use any formulation that you think is easier. Normally, most of y'all will use the net income formulation because it's the bottom line, right? Bottom line is the so-called the easiest to just plug from the financial statement. So you can use that as well. So the net income formulation is generally the most used, unlike your EB and EBITDA, which are, I guess, a bit more relevant for like your class quiz, your test, where it's a question given to you, and then they expect you to use that formulation. Okay. Do you have any questions? Okay. Maybe no questions. So let's look at one example here, right? So this example again is quite similar to our DDM lecture. It's exactly the same kind of the same company as well. We just added a bit more information here and there. Right. So you have ACME Limited had revenue of 120 million in 2011. Its EBIT margin is 20%. So we're given the EBIT margin here. Working capital as a percentage of sales is 30%. So we have a working capital amount of 30%. Revenues are expected to grow at a constant rate of 10% every year. So it's going to grow 10% non-stop. And this 10% basically is your G, right? Your growth rate G. Its debt has a market value of 800 million. Okay. The company has a target capital structure of 40%. So we know what is the capital structure that they want to achieve, 40%, meaning there is 60% equity, right? Okay. The company has a target, the cost of debt is 8%, cost of equity is 14%, number of shares outstanding is 50 million. Calculate the value per share using the FCFF model, right? So hopefully you can kind of remember in the first slide that we discussed, we have discussed the formulation of how we calculate value per share, right? So this is what we want to find, value per share using the FCFF model. Okay. And then what's interesting here is at the end, we have this comment that says that, you know what, you can assume that capital investment will offset depreciation. So we'll look at how this affects our calculation in the next slide, right? And then in the next couple of slides, we'll also explain how does this work in real life. Okay, so let's start off with the calculation of our EBIT first, right? We know that revenue is 120 million as stated in the question. EBIT is always 20%, right? So let's say that's 20% of 120. This is our EBIT. Now, the question has given us that capital investment equals to depreciation. So I'm just going to zoom into this component here. So what does this mean? Capital investment equals to depreciation. So where's the capital investment in this equation? Which term is capital investment? NCS, you're right. So NCS equals to our depreciation. So I'm going since the question give me the EBIT, I'm just going to use the EBIT formulation. It's the simplest one. This is directly given the question. So basically, our NCS is going to cancel out the depreciation here. Right? Again, I repeat, the NCS is going to cancel out the depreciation in our operating cash flow. So this is going to cancel out, meaning that in our operating cash flow is simply just EBIT times 1 minus tax, right? Because in the question is given that the NCS is going to cancel out depreciation. Okay, this is what it means, right? NCS is going to cancel out depreciation here. Now, capital in the question is given 30% of the revenue, therefore you can get 36 million. Yes, correct. So yeah, because of the last comment here, which is this, right? The investments will be offset by depreciation. So capital investment is NCS, which will be offset by the depreciation. Now, in terms of the revenue for the next year, which is 2012, we know that the revenue is going to grow at 10%. So it grows by 10%. EBIT again is exactly the same, where it's 20% of our revenue. So this is our EBIT. And working capital, it's going to be 30% of our revenue, right? 30%, so this. And just be very careful. So I'm just going to zoom in the formula here. So the formula is this, right? The formula is actually change in net working capital, right? We're looking at what? The change. So basically, we need to calculate the working capital for 1 year and the working capital for the second year, and then find the difference, right? Is the change, which is the reason why we have calculated the working capital for 2011, working capital for 2012, and we calculate the change, right? What's the addition? So between here and here, 36 minus 39.6, there's going to be a 3.6 million increase in working capital, right? This 3.6, sorry, is actually this value here, which is the change in net working capital. Okay, this is important. I repeat again. For the working capital, we are calculating the change, meaning that we need to calculate the working capital for 1 year and the working capital for the other year, and then we calculate the difference of both years, right? To determine the change in working capital. Now, having calculated this, remember that we mentioned for our operating cash flow, okay, I'm just going to zoom in here again, it's just this, right? EBIT times 1 minus tax, because our NCS is going to cancel out the depreciation here. Okay, so this is what I've done here. EBIT times 1 minus tax. And then what is this minus 3.6? So this minus 3.6 is your change in net working capital, which we have calculated here, right? 3.6. Okay. So there's a small comment here that we can only calculate the FCFF for 2012 because we need to calculate the change in net working capital. And so the change is based on 2011 minus 2012, right? To calculate the change in net working capital. Okay, so having calculated our FCFF, now we calculate the WACC, right? Because this is free cash flow to firm, so we need to calculate both the we can calculate WACC. The thing is, the question is quite nice. So they have given you the cost of debt. So cost of debt is 8%. So you can flip back to the question. So 8%, they told you that the tax rate is 20%. And then remember the target debt structure. So I'm just going to flip back just to please show you. Target debt structure is 40%, so 60% equity, right? Like what we talked about earlier. So then our equity component is this, right? This equity component, 0.6 times 14, which 14 is the cost of equity. And so that's how we get our WACC. So because this is on a stable growth, we know that it's going to grow at 10%, right? They mentioned that the revenue is going to grow at 10%. So because of this, then we use the present value of the growing perpetuity to determine the value of the firm, right? So this is the value of the firm because we are on FCFF. The question gave you that the market value of the debt is 800, right? So the market value of the debt, we can calculate the value of equity by taking the value of the firm minus the market value of the debt to give you the value of equity. And then we have 50 million shares outstanding, right? Here, outstanding shares 50 million. So because of question one, per value per share, so we take the value of the equity divide by 50 to give you the value per share. Do you have any questions on this? No? Okay, that's good. Good. Okay, thank you. So then the question you might have is, like in the question, right, they mentioned that the NCS is going to offset our depreciation. So the question is, how come we do not take into account the depreciation? What is the underlying reason, right? So there are two stages, right? High growth stage and normal growth stage. Let's look at the high growth stage, right? So what is the reason, the qualitative reason of not of this offsetting that's happening, right? So for high growth, we typically assume that the asset turnover is constant, right? So how much new asset you buy is going to be constant, right? And how much is being retired is going to be a constant rate of asset turnover. So in terms of our capital investment, it will be the difference between the gross fixed asset of the two period, right? So if we have a fixed asset amount of 100 and the next year is 200, then we have invested additional capital of 100, right? And this 100 of capital investment, basically it has to provide for the depreciation of the existing machine, which is going to depreciate, as well as any change in fixed asset, meaning that are you buying new fixed asset, right? So the amount of capital investment is first to cover the depreciation as well as any purchase of new fixed asset, right? Or change in fixed asset. So we know that in the last formula that we have seen here, we know that this depreciation here offset the depreciation in our operating cash flow, right? So the depreciation under NCS cancel out the depreciation operating cash flow, which means that we only need to provide additional capital investment that is beyond the depreciation amount, right? Meaning what? I'm just going to flip back to show you. We only need to provide this capital investment, right? So any capital investment that is more than your depreciation, because depreciation is going to cancel out, right? So any capital investment, which is your NCS, that is more than depreciation, this is the amount that we have to provide for, which is why we only provide for depreciation, capital investment that is more than the depreciation charge, because our depreciation or NCS cancel out the depreciation in our operating cash flow. So basically what we're providing for is this part here, change in fixed asset, right? This is the amount of capital investment we have to provide for because their depreciation charge is going to cancel out the depreciation in our operating cash flow. Right. Now, in a normal growth, then how we think about this offsetting of depreciation, right? So in the normal growth, what happens is that it means the company is growing, but it does not need any external financing, right? Because it's just growing normally. So it's not a supernatural growth where it needs to borrow money to grow even more, right? So in normal growth, it's just going to grow normally. Now, in this sense, any funds required for the capital investment would be from the depreciation of asset, right? Because we're not going out for external investments, funding. So whatever funds needed for capital investment is just from the depreciation that is being charged. So we only therefore need to provide for capital investment, additional capital investment that is beyond the depreciation charge. So why are we trying to understand this? Is because sometimes the question can be quite tricky, right? They explain to you, oh, this is a normal growth, it's not looking for external financing. And so, what does this mean? It means that in terms of capital investment, we only need to provide it beyond the depreciation charge for that period, right? Or they can give you a scenario where it's a high growth, and in a high growth, then again, it's kind of the same concept. We need to provide depreciation that is beyond the depreciation charge, but maybe the reason is slightly different, right? Because that one is the fixed asset turnover and whatever that we've discussed earlier. Right. Again, feel free to stop me if you have any questions, right? And you can type them in the chat or even unmute yourself. All right. So we have talked quite a bit on the single stage FCFF. Now let's go into the two-stage FCF, right? And there are two stage, right? Let's go and focus on the simple two stage. Okay. So for the simplest two stage, we have two parts, right? We have the GS, which is growth supernatural, and then we have the GL, which is the growth long term. So just a recap on the two stage, what happens is that the company is going to grow at a super fast pace for X number of years, right? It can be 5 years. Then after that, it's going to go to a normal growth pace, which is the GL. Okay. And how we calculate the firm value is in two parts, right? First, we determine the present value of the cash flows for the supernatural growth, right? It can be for 5 years. So the 5 years present value of the cash flows. Having done that, then we determine the terminal value given here, right? TV, right? Terminal value. But because this terminal value is as of, let's say, year five, if there was 5 years of supernatural growth, so it's as of year five, therefore we have to PV, right? And this is the PV formulation where we present value the terminal value. Okay, and in all cases, we need to consider that the free cash flow to the firm is as of 1 year from today, right? Remember in our DDM model, we have discussed this, that in terms of the formulation of the perpetuity or annuity, it has to be, the cash flow has always to be 1 year from today, right? Which is why we always use D1, right? Remember in the last lecture, instead of D naught. So exactly the same, the free cash flow to firm, that cash flow has to be 1 year from today. So let's dissect this example, right? So this example will provide you a good understanding of the two-stage using the FCFF model. Okay. So what's this example saying? So we have Apex Manufacturing has a current sales of 50 million, right? So current sale 50 million, we expect to grow at 14 million for next 4 years. So 14 million is going to be, 14%. So 14% is going to be the supernatural growth, which is the GS. From 5 year onwards, the growth rate is expected to be at a normal growth of 6%, right? So this is our GL, right? It's going to drop to GL of 6%. During the growth stage, the capital investment is expected to grow at a normal 20%. So capital investment, 20%, while depreciation is expected to grow at 25%, right? So there's different. There's going to be some capital investment required at a growth stage, and also some depreciation that is 25%, keep growing 25%. So during the normal growth stage, depreciation will offset capital investment. So let me just use a different color here. So this is the same offsetting thing that we talk about, right? Let me just erase this. So depreciation will offset during normal growth. So the depreciation and capital investments will offset each other. Now, the EBIT margin will remain at 24% for the whole period, right? Working capital remain at 20% of the sales for the whole period. Now, currently the equity is 20 million. So we have 20 million equity, 20 million debt, right? So 50-50. At the moment, it's 50-50, yeah? So 50-50 is as of supernatural growth. Okay, the number of shares outstanding is 1 million. Cost of debt, which is 10%. The cost of debt 10% is now, right? And cost of debt during normal growth is 9%, and all of it is after tax, right? So meaning that we don't have to account for tax later in our WACC formula. Capital investment last year was 2 million, so they tell you what was the initial capital investment, and the depreciation 1.6. Okay. Okay, I see a question. Why don't you take account? Uh, so we don't. So I'm for tax. Yeah, tax because after tax. Because after tax rate, that means this amount 10% is after the tax already. So after tax, cost of debt. So we do not need to take account the tax in our WACC later. That's after tax, right? Risk-free rate is 5%. Yeah, already accounted for. Yeah, right. So risk rate is 5%, market risk premium 7%, beta during growth stage is 14, and normal is 11, 14, 1.4, and normal is 1.1. Right? So you have different beta, 1.4 and 1.1 for the beta. Calculate the value per share, again, using the FCFF. So we are using FCFF, but we want to calculate the value per share. So again, we need to fall back on our formulation. Remember in our first slide that we talked about it, to calculate the value per share. Right? In the question, it's also given that tax rate is 20%. During the normal growth, equity is 2/3, debt is 1/3. Right? Recall that currently, so I'm just going to highlight to you again, currently the equity is 20 million, debt is 20 million. So currently 50-50, but later in the normal growth is going to be 2/3 equity, 1/3 debt. So let's do the simplest one first, right? Let's just calculate the WACC. Usually that's the simple one. So we first calculate the cost of equity, right? In the question, it was given to us that there are two different betas. The beta of 1.4, which is the higher one, is for the growth, and 1.1 for normal, right? So with the beta, we can calculate the cost of equity given here. And then we calculate the WACC for the growth and normal as well, right? WACC. Now, I would like to repeat again that it's 50% for 50% equity, 50% debt. So 50% debt, 50% equity, 1/3 debt, and 2/3 equity for normal, right? And just to highlight again, for your debt, 9 and 10%. So you can flip back to your question. The 9 and 10% is right after tax. So meaning that you do not need to you don't need to take 1 minus tax rate, right? 1 minus T. So you don't need to do it anymore because it has to be taken into account. And we determine that the WACC is 12.4 and 11.5. Okay. You've done this. Now, okay, let's see, there's a question. So we can just change in beta and capital structure. Yes. So I think the way I think is that because it's two stage, that's why there's two different beta uh, for the growth. There's a beta for growth and beta for normal, right? For two-stage model compared to a single-stage model, where single stage is generally just one beta, right? Is that what you're asking? So yes, you're right. So if there's two stage, you typically will have two beta or two WACC as well, because you will have two different growth level, and each growth level will have different with the average cost of capital, right? Different WACC, right? Thanks for the question. So very good. Now, so we have determined the denominator, right? So this is the discount factor here, right? Your WACC is a discount factor. So let's calculate the numerator now, right? And this is the more complicated part, which is why we have this table here to show it, explain to you. Okay. So in the numerator, because the question gives us the EBIT, right, where they say 24% is 24% of the sales is the amount of EBIT, right? So the EBIT margin is 24%. So we use, because the question will give us the EBIT, we use the simplest formulation here, the EBIT formulation. Now, the FCFF formula has four components, right? What does this mean, four components? Component one, so I circle it in red, two, three, and four, right? Four components. One, two, three, four. So for all the four components, these will be in the red. So in the rows that are red, these are each component, right? So we have one here, two, three, and four. Four components, right? So let's try to see how we can derive that. So we understand from the question that sales start at 50, right? It's given the question, it starts at 50 million. And your sales is going to grow at a normal pace of 14%. No, sorry, not a supernatural pace at 14%, right? For the first 4 years, which is what we see here, and then grow at a normal pace of 6%, right? So I'm just going to flip back just to show you. This is the values we are picking, right? 14% at supernatural and 6% at normal, right? Given the question as well, right? So we determine the sales in year one, year two, year three, year four, year five. We know that for the EBIT, it's just going to be a flat 24%, right? So we are just going to multiply to 0.24, 0.24 throughout, right? Because it's just going to be a flat 24%. And then the first formulation that we need to calculate for your FCFF model is that we need to calculate the EBIT times 1 minus tax. So EBIT times 1 minus tax, right? So we just multiply by the 1 minus tax. Because we have calculated EBIT, we just multiply 1 minus tax, 1 minus tax, 1 minus tax, 1 minus tax, 1 minus tax here to give you the first formulation. Right? The second formulation that is in red is our depreciation. And the question has given us that the depreciation starts at 1.6 and it's just going to grow at a flat pace, right? In a supernatural growth, a supernatural growth stage, which is 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. Our NCS or capital investment is going to grow at 20%, right? Starting from 2 million, it's going to go 20%, 20%, 20%. However, what's interesting is that there's going to be an offset happening at once it hit normal growth stage, right? I'm just going to flip back to show you. Remember this thing here, this offset happening. So at a normal growth, the depreciation is going to offset your capital investment needs. So it's exactly what's happening here, right? The offset is happening here. So there's not going to be any more depreciation because it's just going to offset by the net capital spend or NCS. Okay. In terms of working capital, net working capital is going to be 20% of sales. So we are going to determine the 20% sales, 20% of sales. So these are sales. So I'm just going 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%. But again, I hope to emphasize to you that what we're interested in is the change in net working capital. So I'm going to put a star here, right? Because this is one of the more typical, I would say, mistake that sometimes if you're doing questions too quickly, you can't miss it, right? So this is the one of the one that you need to take note. I'll just put 3 stars here, right? So this one, you need to make sure that you are doing the change in net working capital, meaning I'm going to take this net working capital minus this one here, which is what is done here. And then for the next one, I'm going to take this one minus this one here, which is given here, right? So hopefully you can see that we are finding the change in that capital. Let me just change the colors a bit. All right. Okay. So I've got all my red components, right? My red components are the components. Oops, sorry. Red components are components of my FCFF. And so what I do just to show you in one page is I'm going to just copy and paste all my red components, which is this part here, all my red numbers here, just to show you. And then I'm going to just calculate out my FCFF by taking one. So I take my first component, which is 10.94 plus depreciation, right? Plus depreciation minus NCS and minus net change in working capital, right? So I'm just plugging all the components here just for easy explanation, right? I just copy over and paste it here. So I've now determined all my cash flows that's happening here, my free cash flows to the firm. But this is not done yet, right? So I'm just going to plug in my WACC, which I've calculated earlier. Just to be careful that on year 5, it's going to drop to normal growth, meaning that my WACC will be reduced to 11.5. So we need to determine the present value of our cash flows for the start, right? Recall the valuation is determine the present value of the cash flows. So you present value my 9.14, you present value my 10.5, you present value everything back, right? The 4 cash flows back. On our fifth cash flow, that is where it's going to drop to normal growth. And when you drop to normal growth, we determine and this is going to be forever, so we determine the present value of growing perpetuity, right? And the question say at normal growth is just grow 6%. So we just present that you determine the present value of your growing perpetuity as your terminal value. And then the last step is that I will need to present value the terminal value, right? So I'm present valuing the terminal value, meaning I'm going to discount this value back 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 years. Be very careful that you must use the WACC of 12.4%, which is the WACC of GS, growth supernatural, right? So I'm actually using the WACC of 12.4%. So you do not use the WACC for 11.5. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this. This is a very critical point, is that when we go and discount our terminal value for 2-stage model, we need to discount the terminal value based on our WACC of our supernatural growth, WACC of GS, which is 12.4. Okay. May I pause here for a short while at this point in time? Do we have any queries? Because this is a very important explanation, like any parts that I'm unsure, it's a good time to ask. Right? Feel free. Okay, perhaps maybe no questions at the moment. So encourage you to, try to redo this example by yourself without looking at answers on Excel. It won't take so long. It's quite fast, but try to do it yourself by your own because by practicing, you at least once you will kind of grasp the calculation quite quickly. All right. So this is a summary of what we have to do. I will not go through that. All right. Okay. Uh, there is. So recall in last lecture, we talked about the annuity method. You recall the annuity method? Yes. So you can actually do that. And recall that in the last lecture, we talked about how um, especially for those who are interested in doing the CFA, you must use the annuity method because you do not have a Excel for you to do it year by year, right? You need to, and there's no time for you to do year by year, like this, because then you will not be able to finish your CFA paper. However, given the purpose of this course, you are quite lucky because you can use Excel and for all your open book assignments, right? Open book assignments, whether it's class tests or your GPA or ECA, right? So then maybe just using the year by year is easier. But you're right. I really like the question. So do remember that you can use your annuity method, the annuity formulas. Okay, then we determine the value of the firm, right? So the value of firm, what we do is we add the present value of the four cash flows here, present value of four cash flows, and the present value of the terminal value, PV of TV, right? Which is given by this. So this gives you the value of the firm. And so having the value of the firm, we know that in the question they tell you the market value of the debt, right? The market value of the debt is 20, right? So given though we know the market value of debt, we can determine the value of the equity, right? Just take the value of the firm minus the market value of the debt, give you value of equity, and then we divide it by number of shares outstanding, which is 1 million, to give you the value per share. Okay. So again, I repeat that sometimes if you look at questions, right, in case in your class test, you'll see that, hey, they might ask you calculate the value of the equity using the FCFF method. So hopefully you are not too surprised, like, hey, how come they want me use calculate the equity value using FCFF? So hopefully these two examples that went through give you a good understanding that do not be too surprised that you can actually calculate the value of the equity using FCFF because FCFF is actually the valuation for firm, right? Not just the equity. So do not be surprised. You actually calculate it that way. Okay. So next we'll calculate go into FCFE, but I think now is a good time that we take a break as well. As you know, we like to do two breaks in our lecture. So let's maybe come back around 8:10, around 8:10, thereabouts, and then we'll continue on FCFE. Okay. Welcome back. So let's continue with the FCFE, right? So we have covered the FCFF, and now for the FCFE, it's going to be more or less the same, right? Not much difference. We are going to look at the no growth, stable growth, and a simple two-stage. The only difference now is the numerator, where we're going to use the FCFE formula, and the denominator, where we're just going to change the WACC to our cost of capital. Return on equity or cost of equity, right? Okay, so let's talk about the no growth stage. So in the no growth FCFE, again, we're just going to, since growth is zero, we're going to use the present value of perpetuity. Now, for FCFE, because you are immediately going to calculate your equity value, you can determine your value per share immediately by just dividing it by number of shares outstanding, right? Unlike your FCFF, we need to remove our market value of that. In terms of if it's growing at a stable rate of, let's say, G, G could be, G equals to 8%, let's just say, then we have the stable growth. And so this does your growing perpetuity, present value of growing perpetuity. Now, for our numerator, we have kind of seen this formula in our lecture 2 as well, right? But let's go in a bit deeper and try to understand the formula a bit more. So in our FCFE, we can actually derive this formulation using our FCFF model, but now we just need to do two adjustments, right? The first adjustment is to our interest expense, and the next adjustment is into our net borrowings. And in both cases, they are relating to debt, right? So just recall again, first question I kind of asked during class is what? Is that the difference between the FCFE and FCFF is that our FCFE is only to the equity holders, meaning that we need to account for the cash flows that are relating to debt. So in this case, if we start off with our FCFF, therefore, then we need to remove away the interest expense, right? Because this is a cash flow that is affecting our debt, which will affect our equity holders, as well as any cash flow from borrowings, right? And we call it net borrowings. So what is net borrowings? The idea of net borrowings is this: is there any cash coming in from taking on more borrowings? And then, of course, when you take on more borrowing, sometimes you have some repayment, right? Repayment of our bank loan. So then we need to repay. So what is the net cash flow that we have received from our borrowings, which is our net borrowings? So we can calculate net borrowings by determining the additional borrowings minus any loan repayment, right? Amount of loan that you repay. So the net version is just the cash flow that's coming to you after you have taken on more loans and actually repay your existing loan. So what's the additional cash flow you get? Alternatively, if we look at the balance sheet, we can determine it by taking the change in short-term debt plus the change in long-term debt, right? And how we determine the change? We just take this year's short-term debt minus last year's short-term debt, and this year's long-term debt minus last year's long-term debt. That's how we determine the change, to determine the net borrowings as well. So this is our basic formulation for our FCFE. Of course, what we can do is also plugging in the various formulation for FCFF that we have discussed earlier before the break, right? So we can plug in I like to call it the base form of our FCFF, right? The base form is our net income form. And so this is our base formulation, right? This is our base formulation here. And then remember that we have the green part, which is the NCS minus net change in working capital. So this is due debt, right? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug back in this component here into here, right? And so what's interesting about our net income formulation is that we have both the interest expense times 1 minus tax. So what we can do is we can just cancel out here, right? Interest expense times 1 minus tax. We can just strike it off. And therefore, what we get is a simpler formulation of our FCF. We can do this for the EBIT and EBITDA formulation as well. However, in both forms, you will notice that we cannot really simplify the components here anymore, right? Because there's no way to simplify. Okay? For FCFE formulation, again in lecture 2, we did mention that there's a kind of another formula to use, right? We can use the idea of a debt ratio where I think one of you also asked, what is a debt ratio? So debt ratio is just your total debt divided by total asset. So there's a formulation where what we do is we need to adjust the NCS by the debt ratio, and we adjust the net change in net working capital by the debt ratio, right? So we adjust both by the debt ratio to get your FCFE formulation. So recall in your FCFF, we have alternative formulation as well using the cash flow statement. Remember the operating cash flow that we discussed. So for FCFE, we also have alternative formulation using our debt ratio, which is what is in here, right? The debt ratio. Okay. So in our two-stage FCFE, exactly the same as our FCFF, right? We're going to calculate the cash flows coming in the supernatural growth stage, which is GS. And then we're going to determine the present value of your growing perpetuity in your GL, right? And then we present value our terminal value. So we'll look at this example. I think the best way to understand this is a true example. And this is exactly the same example as what we covered in our FCFF, other than some small minor changes so that we can calculate the value per share using our FCFE formulation. So this one, I might go a bit faster, right? Because it's kind of exactly the same, other than some small differences here and there. So sales again, 50 million, no change, growing at supernatural at 14, and for next 4 years and 5 year onwards, it's growing at 6% for long term. Okay. Growth during the growth stage, capital investment is growing at 20%, depreciation at 25%, right? Exactly the same. Now, in the normal growth, depreciation is offset the capital investment needs. So there's going to be some offsetting happen when there's a normal growth level. The net profit margin is remain at 12%. So this is net profit margin. So previously it was EBIT, right? So this is net profit margin now, 12%. The working capital will remain at 20% of sales. And okay, so this is important. They give you the debt ratio remains at 40%. So once they give you debt ratio, I'll put a star here, right? So whenever you look at a question and give you debt ratio, put a star here because this means that they want you to use the 1 minus debt ratio formulation, right? So long as they give you a debt ratio, please use the 1 minus debt ratio formulation to calculate your numerator, which is your FCFE. Okay. The number of shares outstanding is 1 million, which will remain at same level. The capital investment during the last year, so last year, they tell you what's last year, is 2 million, depreciation is 1.7, kind of the same as what we covered earlier. Risk-free rate is 5%, market risk premium is 7%, beta and growth is 4, so 1.4 and 1.1, exactly the same as the previous question, right? And then the question they want you is calculate the value of this company's share. Okay. So for FCFE, it's a bit easier because we do not need to calculate the WACC. We just need to calculate the cost of equity. So cost of equity, we just need to be careful that the betas are different. So in the growth stage, the beta is 1.4. In a normal, it's a 1.1 beta. Right? So again, I repeat that so long as the question gives you the debt ratio, please use the debt ratio formulation. So we can use the debt ratio formulation here because the debt ratio is 40% as given in the question, right? Now, we start off with, again, we start with sales, but then because in the debt ratio formulation, we just need the net income, and the question gives us that the net income is just 12% of sales. So we start with the sales, again, it's growing at 14% for 4 years and then 6% after that, right? The net income is 12%, so it's just 12%, 12%, that's 12%, right? So we get the net income. So in the same way, what we're going to do is we are going to determine component 1, 2, and 3, right? There are going to be 3 components here, 1, 2, and 3. And they are going to be rate as well, right? So we have determined component 1 here. This is going to be component 2, and this is going to be component 3, okay, in rate. So component 1, net income, we have determined that. Now, component 2 is our NCS minus depreciation. So we know that in the question is quite similar to our FCFF, where the depreciation is going to grow at a constant pace of 25%, and our NCS is going to grow at 20%, and then there's going to be some offset at the end, right? There's going to offset once it's at a normal pace. So in our second component here, what we're going to do is we need to take the 1 minus debt ratio times NCS minus depreciation, which is what I'm going to do here, right? To calculate our component 2. And we know that at a normal growth, our depreciation is going to offset our capital investment. So then once you reach year 5, which is the normal growth, there's going to be offsetting, nothing will happen, right? So the value is going to be 0 from there onwards, right? So for the net working capital, again, I'm going to repeat this again. The formulation is using the change, right? I'm just going to highlight here. I'm going to put a star here, so it's the change. So we need to calculate the working capital year 0, year 1, which is basically just 20% of the sales, and then we calculate the change here, right? These are the change. So again, for our FCFE, we need to adjust based on the debt ratio. So we take the change in net working capital multiplied by 1 minus debt ratio. So 1 minus 40% is to get our adjusted change in net working capital. Again, this is in rate because it's our third component of our FCFE, right? So our FCFE has 3 components. 1, the net income. 2 is the NCS, and 3, which is the change in net working capital. So similar to what I've done previously, I've plugged the 3 components here, right, for easy presentation. And then I will just take the first component minus the second component minus the third component based on the formula here, right? So I just take 6.84 minus 0.17 minus 0.84, right? To give you the various FCFE, right? However, again, the same thing is that we cannot stop there. We need to find a present value, but please just be careful that our return on equity for the first 4 years is 14.8. However, our return on equity in 5th year is 12.7. So there's going to be a slight difference in terms of our return on equity. Okay. We discount our 4 years cash flow, and then for 5th year, we calculate the present value of growing perpetuity as it will grow at the 6% growth rate, G. And last but not least, we need to discount the terminal value back to year 0 for year 1 by 4. So we use the discount rate based on the supernatural growth, which is GS, right? The GS, the return on equity for GS, which is the high growth return on equity. Questions? So, any questions? So you will see that it's quite structured in terms of the calculation, even for your FCFE. And so once you know how to do your FCFF, your FCFE is more or less the same, right? It's not too difficult because it's quite structured. Maybe there's some subtle difference in terms of calculating the formulation for FCFE, the numerator, the cash flow numerator. Other than that, it's more or less the same. And just need to be careful that we are using the cost of equity. So this is a summary. Now, for this, a bit more straightforward because our FCFE valuation, you are already calculating the value of the equity. So we just sum all the present values. We get this. And then what do we do is that we just divide it by 1 million to get the value per share, right? So there's no need to minus or less of the market value of the debt. Because for this valuation, you are already calculating the market, you're already calculating the value of the equity. Okay. Now we discussed slightly about a bit about this during the lecture 2 as well. And again, we'll not really talk much about this three-stage model. I just want to highlight to you that the three-stage model is a combination of the H model and the present value of various cash flow kind of model, right? The various cash flow. So basically the present value of annual ECAP plus the H model kind of combination. For the purpose of the course, you will not need to know how to calculate these. However, for those who are doing your CFA, this is part of your curriculum, right? So we need to know how to calculate the three-stage model for your CFA. So before we move to residual income, any questions regarding a free cash flow model? So we have covered the FCFF and FCFE, and those two are the main free cash flow model, which you typically use for your GBA. On top of the other, whether you use a DDM or residual income or EBA model, right? But most of the time, you will use at least the FCFE or FCF, at least one of them. So do we have any questions? Yes. So for the ECA, as you know that this module, the purpose of this module is really just to teach you how to value a firm, right? And when we start off with the first lesson, almost like when we are in kindergarten, right? I keep on emphasizing that the idea is to equip you with frameworks or with tools to help you value a company, right? And it's really up to you on what tools you want to use to value a company. So, to your question, this calculation will be used for ECA. Yes, so it's your choice whether you want to use these tools, whether you use the FCFE, FCFF, or maybe you just use DDM model to calculate or to value a firm. So it's up to you, right? Yeah. Thanks for the question. Okay, so if we have no other questions, let's move on to our residual income model, right? So again, we mentioned about this in lecture 2, right? We discussed about residual income a bit as well. We just do a recap, right? So the idea of residual income is slightly different from our free cash flow model to the extent that the residual income model reflects things like opportunity cost, right? Basically, it reflects implicit and explicit costs, right? Recall in lecture two. So I'm just, since I have lecture two here, I'm just going to quickly show you which slide we're talking about so you can recap if you forgotten. Remember this slide where we mentioned economic profit is revenue minus all costs, and all costs means implicit and explicit costs. So implicit cost includes things like your opportunity costs, right? So this is what residual income focuses on, which is different from your net income type of model, which is what we have been discussing for the last hour and a half, where it was just focused on financial statements, right? Our net income, our EBIT, our EBITDA, right? But for our residual income model, we are looking at economic profits, which means that we're going to look at the things like opportunity costs. Okay? And we determine this opportunity cost by calculating the cost of equity capital, right? And we take the return on equity minus the cost of equity, right? And we'll see that in a bit because we can't really know the formulation. We discussed it in lecture two, but we'll revisit this again. Okay. Um, and the residual income model is very similar to our FCFE, where we're actually interested in the equity holders, right? And the last model that we're going to learn is the EVA model. And the EVA model is the one that we look at the equity and debt holder, which is therefore very similar to our FCFF, right? Now, for residual income, it's very similar to our FCFE because we are just focusing on equity holders here. Okay? There are other names called economic profit or abnormal earnings model. Yeah. Hopefully, this slide is not new to you. I'm just going to go over to residual income model. We discussed this in quite detail here. So we are going to do a quick recap on this slide. So, question. For residual income model, we take the net income for this year minus the equity charge at T minus 1. So 1 year before that, right? Question, why do we take the equity charge 1 year before, meaning at T minus 1? Why not do we take the equity charge in T? So not sure whether you remember, we had a extensive discussion on this. So why is it equity charge is minus 1 period before? So there are two key reasons, right? One of it is what? What equity will be used to generate the net income? You're right. I like the answer. Perfect. You're right. Perfect. The the net income that you generate will be the amount of equity that you invested at the start of the period. Perfect. You're right. Because of the beginning of the beginning capital. You're right. So whatever net income you generate is the equity that you invested at the start of the year. So the equity that you invested at the start of the year is the equity that you're going to help you generate the income for that year, which is why net income is at T. That's one of the reasons. The second reason is this, right? The second reason is that if you are going to use the equity charge or the book value of equity, meaning here, right? Book value of equity at T minus 1, at T, sorry, at T, if you're going to say at T, yes, you're right, because T will have the retained earnings, meaning what? You're going to double count your net income because you're right. So your book value of equity comes from retained earnings and payout capital, right? And your retained earnings, recall, retained earnings is what? It is your beginning retained earnings plus net income minus dividends, right? And so this means that if you are going to use the value of equity as of T, you would have added your net income as of T. So you're going to have net income, net income. So you're going to double your net income. So this is going to be wrong. You're going to overstate your residual income, right? So it's wrong. So hopefully you can see now that you need to use the equity charge as of T minus 1 because of two reasons. The beginning equity is the amount that you use to invest to generate your net income for the year. And reason two is that if you're going to use your book value of equity as of P, then you're going to double count your net income. Okay. So having explained this, then we can come understand that for your residual income, we take our income minus our book value of equity times cost of equity, right? And so we know that the net income, what's net income? Net income basically your return on equity times your book value of equity, right? So we can actually just do a bit of shifting here and there. We can just take our return on equity minus cost of equity times our book value of equity. So this gives you our residual income. So in case you kind of still a bit unsure what's residual income, I really encourage you to look through lecture 2, because lecture 2 we spend a good amount of time trying to dissect and explain what is residual income, right? Now, why I have a second formulation, the thing is just per share, right? The difference is just per share. And the why I like to put this second formulation is that sometimes when you see question, they might tell you the earnings per share is this, right? However, if I only show you this formulation here, it might not be immediately obvious to you that the earnings per share is just simply the net income per share, right? Because it's just a different name, right? So then you might like, oh, how do I determine residual income from earnings per share, right? So I put it side by side, not really side by side, but one after the other to show you that actually the earnings per share is just simply net income per share, right? So it's exactly the same. So we can use the earnings per share as well, just that everything else has to be per share, right? Equity charge per share, book value of equity per share. And we'd like to highlight here again that the book value equity is just a payout capital plus your retained earnings. And how you determine retained earnings, this is the clean surplus relationship, right? So this is clean surplus relationship, which we discussed in lecture 2 as well. Any queries, any comments? Now, this is the residual income. So when we do valuation using the residual income, there is two components. So again, I repeat, residual income is just one part. But to do a valuation of the equity using residual income, we then need to determine the current book value of equity plus the present value of the residual income. So just now, whatever we talk about is just this part here, residual income. So we do need to present value it, and we do need to add back the current book value of the equity. Okay. So the valuation of the equity using the residual income model is the current book value given by this plus or your present value of your residual income, where RI, meaning residual income, can be given by this, whereas earnings minus equity charge, or it can be this formulation where it's ROE minus cost of equity times book value of equity, right? Which is given here. Can be either this or this formulation. So similarly, our residual income, we're going to look at the same, no growth, stable growth, and maybe even a two-stage, right? So it's the same thing where the terminal value can either be not growing, right? So this one, so terminal value is 0. So basically, the return on equity is the same as the cost of equity. It can be growing at a same level, standard growth level, or your return on equity can decline over time, right? And this one, uh, fortunately, I think for you, it's not part of the syllabus, so you don't have to learn how to calculate this, right? Declining over time. Right. So again, this is just a repeat. Uh, if it's stable growth, it's just going to be a growing perpetuity, meaning G is just going to be flat like this, growing perpetuity, um, and growing at constant growth rate of G. Okay, it can be a two-stage. I didn't show you the no growth, so no growth is just perpetuity. Now, the two-stage, exactly the same, where we have the So I'm just going to highlight to you. We have this part here, right? The summation of our supernatural growth. So this component here, what is all our cash flow, present value of cash flow from our supernatural growth, plus this is your terminal value here, right? TV. And then this is your discount factor, right? Present value. So present value of TV. Now, for your residual income model, you have one more thing where there is the sorry, the beginning book value, right? Because the residual income model starts off with the beginning book value, and then you add in all your residual income that you get. So, just some commentaries on residual income. We'll have one example in a little bit, but just some commentaries. The residual income model is theoretically the same as the underlying model, such as the DDM. So, if you don't remember why, in lecture 2, we also kind of explored the proof of why it's the same. So, you can have a look at that. Okay. However, the inputs are kind of forecast with different degrees of certainty, right? Because our residual income starts off with the book value of equity, BV, which is this thing here, right? It starts off with this thing here, right? For residual income. So there's a degree of certainty on that. Unlike your free cash flow model where you forecast your terminal value, right? So if there is going to be uh, 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 some unknown about the terminal value, then your degree of certainty or your valuation using your cash flow models might not be so certain, right? If the terminal value, you're not so sure about terminal value, then the degree of certainty for your forecast using your free cash flow model will not be so accurate. Okay? Unlike your residual income model, which the value starts off with the base value in your balance sheet. So further commentaries, your residual income is most appropriate when the company is not paying dividends, right? So when it's not paying dividends or have unpredictable dividends, then you cannot use your DDM model. So maybe you use a residual income model. Or the company has negative cash flow. So if negative cash flow, you can't really use the free cash flow model as well. It's not going to give you a good answer. Um, and if there's great uncertainty in terms of existing terminal value, so you do not really know how to forecast the terminal value, right? Uncertainty. So then maybe using the residual income, which focus on the value of equity, might be better. If the terminal value contribute a large percentage of your valuation and you're not sure of the terminal value, again, there's a good reason to use a residual income model. However, one of the main caveats here is that our residual income model, we need to ensure that clean surplus relationship holds, right? Again, I encourage you to look through lecture 2 in case you can't remember what is this clean surplus relationship, right? And we went into a lot of details at that point of time. So some strengths of the residual income model, terminal value does not make up large proportion of the valuation. Residual income, we are using accounting data, and we have one example in the following slides. And you will see that the formulation is slightly different. It's very accounting based. You will see it just in a bit, right? Can be used by for firms that do not pay dividends or do not have a positive a near-term free cash flow, which is what we talked earlier. Can be used when cash flow is unpredictable. So, because it does not use cash flow, right? So if the cash flow is negative, it's unpredictable, no problem. Again, it focuses on economic profitability, meaning that it's going to take into account both the implicit and explicit costs. The weakness, of course, is that the residual income model is accounting data, which could be very outdated, not very relevant. Maybe there might be some adjustments, significant adjustments required. Okay, the clean surplus must hold, right? And sometimes if the ROE is not predictable, then the residual income model is not accurate. Okay, so let's look at example here for residual income model. So this is bulk properties. Expected EPS is $2, $2.50, and $4 for the next 3 years. The analysts expect that bulk will pay dividends of $1, $1.25, and $12.25 for 3 years. The last dividend is anticipated to be a liquidating dividend, and analysts expect bulk to cease operation. So this 12.25 is going to be liquidating dividend. The current book value is $6. The required rate of return on equity is 10%. So calculate per share book value, the residual income for next 3 years. Okay, so we are calculating the RI first. Then the second part of the question is use the RI to determine the valuation using this model, right? Where your B0 is your current book value given by this $6. And then confirm the estimate in part 2 using the discounted dividend model, right? So DDM, to ensure that the valuation is exactly the same. Okay, so let's look at this table here, right? So the residual income model looks actually quite simple, but you need to be very careful because this is a very accounting method of doing things, right? So recall what is a clean surplus relationship. So a clean surplus relationship is this, right? The book value basically equals to the beginning book value plus any net income minus dividends, right? That is the clean surplus relationship. So there's nothing else that's going to affect your book value of your equity. So in the question is given that you start off with $6 as your beginning book value. You add your earnings per share, right? Because this is all book value per share, right? Everything is per share. Then you have your dividends per share of $1. So based on our clean surplus relationship, our ending book value is what? It's just $6 plus our earnings minus the dividends. So you get $7 here. And what happens to this $7? It goes up to the beginning for the following year, right? The following year becomes the beginning. Then in the following year, year 2, we are going to get earnings per share of $2.50. We get dividends again, less dividends of 1.25. And this will give you the ending book value, which then becomes the beginning book value for the following year. Okay. At the end of year 3, our book value is 0. Not surprising because we know that there's going to be a liquidating dividends here, which is 12.25, where it's going to liquidate the company. Now, for our residual income, we need to determine our equity charge, right? What's equity charge? So I'm just going to flip back to the formula. So it's not entirely like never see before. So what's equity charge? Equity charge is given by cost of equity times book value of equity at T minus 1, right? So what's our cost of equity? So in the question, they give you cost of equity is 10%. Now, we need to determine the book value of equity in this case per share at T minus 1, which means that we are using the $6 here as the book value equity at T minus 1. I'm just going to put 2 stars here because this is the part that people will get confused. Sometimes they use $7, which is wrong. For year one, your equity charge is based on the T minus 1 book value here. I put another star here. So this is very important. This is the part that people always get confused. So recall the formula. That's why we spend a lot of time trying to discuss why our book value equity is always T minus 1 and our net income is T, right? So hopefully you can understand. So we need to use the T minus 1 value equity, which is $6 for year one. And then we use again $7 here and 8.25 here for your equity charge. Right? And then what's residual income model? Residual income model is just, residual income is just you take the earnings per share minus the equity charge. So what's your earnings per share? So our earnings per share is this, right? $2 minus 0.6, 250 minus 0.7, right? All these are all your residual income. So one of the question is residual income. So you have determined the 3 residual income here. All right. And then the part 2 is about residual income model, right? What's the value using residual income? Value of the equity. So what do? We simply take you discount the residual income 1.4 by 1 year, 1.8 by 2 years, 3.175 by 3 years, right? We discount it back. And then we have a book value of equity here, which is B naught at year 0. So the last part of the question asks you to compare with the DDM. So we simply take the values here for the dividends and we discount them back to the year 0 and we get exactly the same as our residual income model, showing that the residual income model is equivalent or theoretically the same as the DDM model. Okay, let's pause here. Any questions regarding the residual income model? Because sometimes it can be a bit surprising when you see the calculation for residual income model, and you really need to understand the T minus 1 and T. Do we have any queries? You need okay. Okay, good thing that our lectures are recorded, so you can look through this example again. And if you have any questions, yeah, you can drop me an email. Okay. So the residual income it is a bit different way of thinking, right? So don't worry, it might take a while for you to digest this, right? So it's just a bit of a difference in terms of the calculation. But you can see that the numbers are not difficult compared to our free cash flow model, where you see the calculations are a bit more uh, lengthy, right? It's not difficult, it's just lengthy. So one thing I want to highlight to you that this kind of question can be tested in your class test because it is actually covered in lecture 2, right? So just be careful that, and later I'll repeat again, that you can practice the self-review questions for lecture 3 and 4, 4 meaning this lecture, in preparation for your class test, right? There are good examples for you to practice on. It's a lot. So that's the thing, right? In terms of class tests, obviously they'll tell you that those are short answer questions, MCQ, right? So they will tell you what to use. So that one don't have to worry. You just need to know how to use the method. Now, for your GPA, this is where you need to discuss as a group. Hopefully you can work together and decide which tools you want to use. Remember, at the end of the day, we are giving you many tools, right? Similarly, for qualitative tools, remember we discussed so many things. We discussed Porter's, Pestle, we talk about economic analysis, business sector, we talk about rotation. Like there's so many frameworks we can use. So the trick here is there's no one tool for all kind of valuation. There's no one size fit all kind of valuation technique. It's really about discussing as a group, determine what is the best framework, what is the best qualitative and quantitative tools you hope to use for your valuation, right? So that's the purpose of really this module, right? To give you the tools and for you to make a decision first in your GPA as a group, and then eventually for your ECA, you're going to be alone, right? So when you do it alone, hopefully by then you already understand how to do it, how to do valuation as a group so that you can do it alone. Okay. Okay. Maybe okay. We're almost at 9, so maybe we let's take a short break, maybe 7 minutes break, maybe 9:07, 9:08, and we come back for the last part of the lecture on economic value added. Right? All right. How's everyone doing? Surviving? Okay, that's good. That's good. Um, all right. So just a bit more, hang in there. Let's cover the last quantitative model, right? Hang in there. You're almost there, right? For quantitative models. So the last quantitative model we would like to cover for today's lecture is the economic value added. Okay, so the economic value added is going to be a variation of the residual income model, right? So it's very similar to the residual income model. Um, and the similarity comes in the fact that the residual income model is like your FCFE. Now, your economic value added is like FCFN because we are interested in both the equity and the holders. Okay, so we are going to use the WACC in terms of our discounting, similar to our FCFF. At the same time, in terms of formulation, our economic value added is very similar to our residual income model. So our economic value added uses the NOPAT or net operating profit after tax, NOPAT. And we'll have a lot of discussion on what's NOPAT in just a bit. But we use the NOPAT, which is like the net income, right? Minus the total capital times WACC, and this is called capital charge, right? So we take a NOPAT minus a capital charge. So remember in our residual income model, I'm just going to flip back to show you what is the formulation. Our residual income model uses the net income here, net income minus equity charge. Your EVA, economic value added, uses your NOPAT minus your capital charge. So this is called capital charge here, right? The next slide we see is called capital charge. So really exactly the same, other than the fact that it is concerning both equity and debt holders, right? And in your NOPAT, the simplest form of getting NOPAT is your EBIT times 1 minus tax. Now, this formulation of NOPAT equals to EBIT times 1 minus tax is just really used for questions. Questions meaning questions in like your class tests, right? In real life, NOPAT has a lot of adjustments, right? So I know some of you are already working, and some of you all might even be working in the M&A department. And normally NOPAT is used for M&A, investment valuation, etc., right? And you know that every company, every banks, every consulting company calculates NOPAT differently. So in real life, NOPAT has a lot of adjustments, and we'll see that in a couple of slides later. But for questions relating to school tests, NOPAT can simply use can be calculated using EBIT times 1 minus tax. And we'll see an example in a bit as well. Okay. Now, in terms of total capital, because we are interested in both equity and debt holders, we use the equity plus financial liabilities, right? Total capital, basically. Okay, so economic value added measures the surplus value created on investment. So use the return on capital minus the cost of capital, right? So use the return on capital and cost of capital, and basically it's the same concept where it uses or it provides you both the implicit and explicit costs related to your valuation, right? It provides you the true cash flow to the capital holders because it includes the implicit cost as well, right? It takes into account implicit cost. So then the resultant is the true cash flow. Now, in terms of the EVA calculation, uh, we start with the NOPAT, right? So how do we determine NOPAT? So we can use, okay, so we can use the return on capital minus the cost of capital times the capital employed. Remember, it's very similar to what we see in residual income, where it is just the return on equity minus the cost of equity times the equity book value of equity, right? So exactly the same, but instead of this one, we focus on the capital instead. Now, if we multiply the capital employed like with the return on capital, this gives you our after-tax operating income, which is basically another word for NOPAT, right? And then if we multiply your capital employed times your cost of capital now, this gives us your capital charge, which is basically your WACC times capital employed, right? Your cost of capital is basically your WACC. Okay. Now, let me see. Should we do the example first? Okay, let's do the example first before we go through that component, right? So since we are talking about NOPAT and WACC, let's look at this example called Cradle Limited. So Cradle Limited has a EBIT of 8 million, as we can see here. Total capital of 26 with debt of 12 million. Okay. If the cost of debt is 9%, and the cost of equity is 15%, calculate the EVA, assuming tax rate of 17%, right? So the 9% here they emphasize to you is the pre-tax cost of debt, right? So you do need to account for cost of the tax rate. So earlier, remember I mentioned that in academic exercises for school, your NOPAT is simply your EBIT times 1 minus tax, right? So it's just this. So what's your EBIT? Your EBIT is 8 million times 1 minus tax, 1 minus 17%. This is your NOPAT. Our WACC, on the other hand, we just take the cost of debt, 9% times the 1 minus tax rate, times the value of the debt divided by total capital, right? Total capital is given by 26, debt is 12, right? 12 divided by 26. Then in terms of equity, is just 26 minus 12, which gives you 14, right? So this is the equity amount, right? Which is what we are seeing here, 14 divided by 26 times your 15%, which is your cost of equity. So this is your WACC. So with your WACC and our NOPAT, then we can calculate our EVA, right? We just take NOPAT minus WACC times total capital, right? So total capital, again, I will highlight to you, is 26, which is this thing here. And this is your EVA calculation. Okay. We have one more example here before we go back to the slides that we skipped. So we have ABC Corporation has a net operating profit after tax of 100 million. Its book value of the debt is 150. Book value of equity. So again, I want to highlight to you what they are giving. So this book value of debt, book value of equity is 250. The cost of debt is 10%. The cost of equity is 14%. The stock is selling for 52, and there are 10 million shares outstanding, right? So calculate the economic value added and the market value added for this company. Tax rate is 20%, market value of debt is 150. Now, we first calculate the WACC first, right? And we know from lecture 2 that we have discussed that WACC, we need to use the market value of your debt and market value of equity, right? Everything must be market value, right? You shouldn't use book value. So, what's the market value of the equity? So, we just take the 52 times 10 equals 520, market value equity. The market value of equity plus debt, because debt they will give you, it's quite nice. The debt they will tell you that is 150, right? So the 520 plus 150. And then in terms of your WACC, since the question will give you the 10%, and this is pre-tax as well, so we need to consider tax in our WACC calculation. This gives us a WACC of 12.7. Okay. And then with our WACC, we now can determine our EVA, right? Our EVA, our NOPAT is given by 100. So 100 is already given as NOPAT, minus your WACC times your value of capital employed, right? So just to take note, this capital employed is our book value, which is this one here, 250 plus 150. Whereas your WACC is using your market value. Okay, I repeat again, for your EVA, your capital employed is based on your book value, while your WACC, as we discussed in lecture 2, is based on market value, right? So in case there was some amendment on the slides yesterday, so in case you have downloaded this set of slides, like a week before or even longer, this would be this you'll see there's some difference because that working was incorrect, right? So for those who download the slides way advanced, you might have to re-download the later slides, or you can just cancel off and use these formulas. Any questions? Okay. Now, the second part of question is calculate the MVA. So what's MVA? So MVA is the market value added. So the market value added is basically comparing what? You have your market value of the firm, then you have the book value of the firm, right? There's going to be some discrepancy between the market value and book value. And so we take the market value minus the book value to get you your market value added. So what's our market value? So our market value is this, right? 150, which is the market value of debt, plus our market value of equity, 520. The market value of the firm. And then what's the book value of the firm? Book value of the firm we have already calculated earlier, which is this, right? 400 here. So we just take 670 minus 400, and this gives you a market value added. So how much value is added by the market to your book value? Okay. Okay. So again, if you have downloaded your slides way advanced, these slides might be slightly different. You can re-download the new slides. They are already in Canvas. Apologies, I should have mentioned this at the start of the lecture. But yeah, so I'm just adding a bit more details for the adjustments needed for NOPAT. Remember, when we discussed the EVA, I told you that for academic exercise, NOPAT is quite easy to calculate. You just take EBIT times 1 minus tax. But this is never ever used in the industry because this is a bit too simplistic, right? So NOPAT, so let's think about the idea of NOPAT, right? The idea of NOPAT basically is trying to show you the cash flows from the operation, or not really cash flow, sorry, the profit or the net income or the net profit from operations only, right? So when we think about net profit from operations, then you have to remove or add things that we feel are not relating to operations. Okay, so again, this is not an exhaustive list. There can be a lot of other adjustments being made. These are just some typical adjustments being made, and I've tried to explain to you why such adjustments are made. Right? First of all, we add back the interest expense. So why we add back interest expense is because interest expense, meaning the amount of debt you take, right? So more debt you take, the more interest you incur. So the amount of debt you take, it is relating to your capital structure, right? How you're going to fund your operations, the capital structure of the company. It's not so much about operations, right? So in most cases, our NOPAT will be unlevered. So when we take unlevered, I know some of you all have taken your corporate finance course where you talk about unlevered beta. Similarly, for NOPAT, is unlevered NOPAT. So you remove your interest expense by adding it back. And why we have after tax? Because our interest expenses will benefit from tax shield, right? So when you unlevel your NOPAT, it allows you to compare between two companies as well that has different leverage because you remove the effect of leverage on your operating profit or your net profit. We typically remove any non-recurring, non-operating gains and losses, and this can include things like investment gains, tax gains, revaluation gains. So these are not really operations, we remove it, right? Gains are being removed, losses are being added back. We add back any net income attributable to NCI, so non-controlling interest. Basically, what this means. So when you look at a financial statement of a company, what you will see is that you will see net income, the bottom line, basically. And then below the bottom line, you'll see this thing called NCI, so net controlling interest profit, right? And so this is being removed for your main profit based on accounting rules. However, this is not correct because if you're just going to focus on operating profits, right, we are actually quite concerned about the NCI, right? Because your NCI is part of your is contributing capital to you, right? So you must include the profits earned from the NCI in your operating income. Do you understand this point? So this point is important. So the reason why I'm going through this addition and subtraction, right, is because I know in your GBA or ECA, in case you want to calculate economic value added, you will have to do such adjustments. And it's insufficient just to use the theoretical NOPAT, which is EBIT times 1 minus tax rate. So if you use that for your GBA or ECA, that'll be wrong. So please do not use that. Please use the industry method of calculating NOPAT, which is all these adjustments being done. And whenever you do adjustments, of course, remember to substantiate and support your adjustments being made. Okay, you also add back amortization of intangibles such as copyright, trademarks, because these do not really reduce in value unless they expire, right? Unless there's expiry. Sometimes copyright can be perpetual as well. So then there's no point to amortize it, right? So we do not want any non-cash kind of related effects on our operating profit, right? Last but not least, we add back R&D expenses. So R&D expenses, why? So R&D expenses is expense for you, right? However, it can actually improve. It's not really operating costs, right? It's about like it's not like admin costs where R&D is just expense. It actually can improve your profits in the future, right? So actually, these R&D expenses shouldn't be very expense off, and therefore we add it back to our net profit to get your NOPAT. Okay, I'll just pause here. Do we have any questions? So this is important because it will be, if you decide to use your economic value added as your GBA for your GBA or ECA, you will need to do such adjustments. So do we have any questions? Okay, that's good. So after your PIN 205, then yeah, this is more understandable. Have you covered Notepad in your PIN 205? Okay, that's good. That's good. So hopefully I'm able to provide you a bit more real life kind of application of your Notepad, right? Because sometimes I remember when I was studying Notepad, it was very vague, like, what's the difference between Notepad and net income, right? It's not very clear at the point in time where I was trying to understand this. So this is the reason why I actually kind of edited this slide a bit, right? To show you why NOPAT is actually not equal to net income or is not equals to your EBIT times one minus tax. Because that one, when you think about it, it's like, EBIT times one minus tax, isn't that like net income, right? It's like, it's so funny, right? But it's very theoretical. So really in real life for NOPAT is all these adjustments and more, right? It can be more as well. So, or it can be less. So you need not be using all these adjustments. This is just some suggested ones. It can be more, less, it can be other stuff, right? For capital employed. So capital employed, basically, again, this slide has been a bit amended. So I want to provide you more examples, more adjustment details, right? So capital employed includes all assets used to run the business. Basically, where we mentioned because our economic value added is like your FCFF, right? Which is your equity plus debt. And when you have equity plus debt, therefore, we want to consider both asset and liabilities. And so we must use the book value. So which is why in just now the example, we use the book value for capital employed, but for WACC, we need to use market value. So this is a very important point. In case you use your economic value added, please use book value for your capital employed, but your WACC, you must use market value, right? Okay. Now, for capital employed, again, it's just not taking all that. This is not equals to balance sheet figure of total asset. It is not, right? Capital employed is just not total asset on the balance sheet. No. Yes, it must include all asset, but there must be some adjustments being made as well for capital employed. And these adjustments include things like operating leases. So operating leases are expenses, but they must be capitalized because they are like assets to you, right? So imagine like you take a a company, let's say, rents a building, right? For office building for 10 years. They already signed the lease for 10 years. They know that they're going to stay there for 10 years. Every year they're going to pay, let's say, 1 million, right? So this is an operating lease to them. And actually, in fact, this office building is like an asset for them for 10 years, right? Which is why we need to capitalize these operating leases. It's like a asset to them, is the capital of the company, right? So you add that in both the asset and the debt component, right? So the asset is like the total value of the 10 years of 1 million, and then the debt also is 10 years of 1 million, right? Because you have to keep paying 1 million for 10 years. R&D expense, the same thing, must be recognized as an intangible investments you add back to the asset, right? So if you notice for R&D expenses, typically they are being expensed off under accounting rules unless you can prove that R&D is going to generate income in the sense of a new research product. So based on accounting rules, only if you can prove that there's going to be a breakthrough, then you can recognize it as intangible. But then in all other cases, you must expense it off. However, for your capital employed in finance, we should always recognize as intangible for our R&D expenses, and we should not expense R&D off because we never know, right? Whether this R&D is going to generate a new breakthrough for your product is very vague, right? You do not know until it happens, right? It's almost the idea of like foresight is 2020, right? Only after it happens, then you know. So at that point of time, before the breakthrough happened, you will never know whether you can actually recognize it as uh, uh, asset to you, an intangible asset, which is why in accounting it's more conservative, right? They want to say, oh, you know what, we don't recognize it until the point of time that you can prove that it's going to generate a business for you or a new breakthrough for you. But in finance, what we're interested in is that we want to reflect the financials of the company in the most appropriate way, right? In a way that people will understand the financials and will see the financial health of the company, right? Because at the end of the day, remember what we're doing here is about valuation, right? So we want to bring the financial statement to the as close as possible to the real value of the company, which is why we're going to add R&D expenses as an intangible investment, which is an asset. Okay, we're going to less off excess cash. So again, this is a bit strange, but then if you think about it, it might make sense because excess cash is cash that's not used in daily operations, right? Remember what we're trying to do here. In the notepad, we are trying to focus on operations. So anything that is excess cash that is not used in operations is more like investment. So we should not really include them in our asset. Last but not least, we add back accumulate depreciation or write down of our fixed asset because these are non-cash, right? The asset doesn't really lose, let's say, $100 per year, right? Let's say our depreciation is $100 per year. It doesn't really lose $100 per year non-stop, right? Maybe at a point of time, there might be a drop in value. Okay, fine. Then you recognize that decrease. But recognizing a straight line $100 doesn't make sense in finance term. It might make sense in accounting term. That's different. Okay. So I hope this gives you a good understanding of capital employed. Because and I spent more time on this to really illustrate this point because I know it will be useful for your GBA, even your ECA as well when you calculate economic value added. Last but not least, WACC, nothing much to talk about. WACC basically use market value, and then in lecture 2, we have kind of dissected how to calculate WACC, right? So, okay. So, advantage of our EVA. So, basically, EVA is closely related to our MPV, i.e., meaning that it's quite close to our discounted cash flows, right? The good thing about the EVA is it avoids the issue of focusing on spreads. So what's this idea of spread? So whenever sometimes you like when you're doing a determination of a project, whether you should take on a project or not. In most cases, people just look at okay, what's the return on this project and what's the cost of the project, right? So then the spread, this is called the spread, the return minus the cost is what you determine whether it's a good or bad project to take, or whether it's not, whether you can or cannot take on the project. Now, having said that, using EVA instead of just return on equity and cost of equity, or return on capital and cost of capital, using this spread, by using EVA, you avoid the risk of turning away good projects, which might have some implicit kind of benefit that is not captured in just looking at spreads. Again, EVA also is a more wholesome kind of valuation. So it allows the manager to have more control in terms of the components and decision making. rather than focusing simply on market price of a the stock price or market price of uh, the stock. And again, EVA is influenced by all decisions, right? So it's a very complete because it includes both implicit and explicit costs. So it includes all decision uh, making of the firm. Investment decision, dividend decision, etc. Financing decision. So everything is being included in your EVA. Okay. So that's all we have for EVA. So I guess you might be relieved that you have covered all the quantitative methods of valuation. So hopefully by now, this will give you a very good grasp of how you're going to tackle your GBA because you will have to use at least one of these methods. Remember, we have covered 5 methods. We have covered the DDM, cash flow, and cash flow we have two, to equity and to firm. We have covered the residual income. And last but not least, we have covered the EVA as well, right? All right. Any questions so far regarding this module, this lecture 4? Yeah, you're right. 3 and 4, we went to the details. Lecture 2, we did an overview, right? So just be careful because for your class test is lecture 1 and 2, but be careful because your content in lecture 3 and 4 can be tested as well because lecture 2 is an overview of lecture 3 and 4, right? So yes, the questions in that is covered in lecture 2 are should be simpler than what is covered in lecture 3 and 4, but the content is lecture 3 and 4, right? So really, if you want to do well for a class test, you will have to study lecture 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? If you are like okay, you want to get A or A plus for this module. If you want to do well, you will have to study lecture 1, 2, 3, and 4 because lecture 2 is an overview of 3 and 4. So if you really understand lecture 3 and 4, then you will do very well for the class test. Again, I also want to highlight to you that there are self-review questions. So I've received some questions regarding practice for the class test. So these are very good practice. So please try them. They are short answer questions. So your class test uh, will include MCQs and short answer questions as well. So these are some examples of short answer questions where there might be multiple parts like ABC, right, or AB, right? So there will be some short answer questions like this. Okay, so in terms of format, uh, so the Nike case, right, it's only focused on WACC, right? So it's not really the full valuation. Now, a good format to follow will be the spandex case, right? Spandex case that is also provided to you. We did not go through a spandex, so that one is for your own self-review. That will be a good example. Or the Archie case. Remember the gold mining company Archie that we covered in the last lecture? So the Archie case is going to be a good example in terms of format. So the Archie case is really going to follow more of the industry industry standard. The spandex case, that one is more I would say dynamic kind of formatting, right? Because I think in Archie case, I think someone also made a very right point that the formatting uh, uh, of your report, the Archie case might be a bit hard, right? Because it's very industry focused, uh, unlike the requirement of a academic report. So then you can follow the spandex case. However, if you want to do it in Archie case format, that is fine too, because that is really the market standard for equity reports. So of course, what we hope to train you is to follow the market, right? And eventually, some of you all who are interested might want to be equity analysts. So then we should work towards the market standard kind of report rather than academic report, which I believe maybe just a small or very, very small handful might feel that it's beneficial if you eventually want to go into academia route, right? But I think a good maybe 98% of us are not so interested in academia route, so then the industry reports are more useful. Okay. Maybe at this point in time, I just leave the floor to any questions regarding the GBA or ECA or class test, right? And then I would like to see whether you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask, clarifications as well. Okay, I see a question. Yes. So maybe we have to blend in both, right? So yes, you have to include the formulas and all because um you have to show that you understand how to do the calculations. So you're right. So you do have to show some level of academia kind of thing where you need to show the formulas, etc. Yeah. But in terms of formatting, you can do it as like a the industry kind of reports. So a couple of ways. So previously, what I've seen is some groups would attach the Excel. You can actually create, like a click-in kind of function for your Word document where you attach the Excel there, and the markers can just double click and it opens the Excel. You can do that as well. Alternatively, you can do some screenshots and put them as appendix. That's fine as well. Yeah, the embedded function. Yeah, you can do it embedded, or you can do some screenshots of important numbers and then you put it in appendix. Remember the Archie case I showed you at the end, there was some appendixes, right? And the appendix includes like the financial statement, the forecast. You can just put a few of the important numbers in the appendix, and then maybe the rest you embed the Excel. You can do that. Yes, of course, I know the next time we meet, you will have submitted your GPA, right? So I just want to emphasize again for your GPA, when you when you are when you have calculated your valuation, right? You put in a lot of effort, you calculated, you do a whole Excel model of your valuation, you do your FCFF, FCFE, everything, you get a number, right? You get $7 per share. Perfect. You did very well. But do not forget what we discussed last lecture on the Archie case, where you need to do some sanity check, where you need to do some kind of testing where you take a step back, right? You take a step back and like ask yourself, oh, okay, is my valuation really that good? Right? You need to do some reflection. So do not forget this because in most cases, this would contribute some portion of your marks. So just simply saying, oh, I get $7 per share. This is an overvalue. I'm going to sell the overvalue. I'm going to sell the share. That is not enough, right? You need to do some level of sanity check. So you need to, I would say, reflect whether actually is your valuation really that good, right? Remember what we discussed in the Archie case. So you need to do some level of that, right? To really show that you want to validate to your valuation and to recognize that your valuation is not perfect, right? It's not like I'm the best valuer. right? You are taking a check on your answers, right? Does that make sense for everybody? Because this is important. So in case you want a sample of this check, we have discussed this in Archie case. At the same time, even for the Nike case, right? In Nike case, even though it's not a valuation, we discussed how there was this check or this kind of reflection discussion on the WACC, where we where we say, oh, suppose my beta is this, then what happens my valuation? Am I closer to the WACC from Refinitiv or from FactSet, etc. Right? So this is the level of sanity check that has to be done. Any other queries they'd like to raise? So, in case you are interested in taking the CFA, I would say this module is very relevant to CFA because it is part of the CFA curriculum. But I must say that in terms of what we cover, because of the format of assessment, not which is not really pen and paper, I would say it's more open book, which is unlike CFA, which is all closed book. Um, or at least not or no laptop basically. So you for CFA you need to know the formulas, but for our purpose of this module, you do not really need to know the formulas because you can just use Excel and Excel gives you all the other stuff, right? So anyone is taking the CFA this year? Are you taking? Okay, maybe not. Yes, so the school does sponsor. I think I have a student also in another uh tutorial group. He's taking the investment one, the investment where the school sponsor the investment exam. I think CMIN or something like that. Chartered investment. Yeah. Yes. So most banks, I would say they sponsor you. So how the sponsorship works for this for companies or like banks, right? Is that you have to pay first, of course. Normally they get you pay. If you pass, you submit your receipt for claim, and then they will reimburse the full amount, right? Of course, if you fail, then they won't reimburse until you pass. So yeah, you're right. So companies do sponsor. I'm sure if you can do well in this module, you are smart enough for the CFA, right? It's the CFA. It's really more of a timed kind of assessment, right? It's not difficult, but it's just the timing is because it's a short period of time and there's a lot of endurance required because it's two papers in one day. That is a tough part. Uh, I think they're both different, right? CFA is finance, ACCA is accounting. Really different. Yeah. Very, yeah, it can be comparable. Yeah. But they are testing also different knowledge. So, so yeah, it's different. Right. Do we have any other questions regarding the class test? GPA. So, okay, maybe there isn't anything now for the time being. However, as you work on the questions, if you do face any doubts, feel free to drop me an email. Uh, I usually reply pretty fast, so I can address your doubts. Of course, um, I usually like to, I think I mentioned this at the start of the module, is that really work together as a group to do your GPA well, because the ECA, right, is about valuation as well, right? So this course is all about valuation. So I would say four brains are better than one. So if you do your GPA well, where you have your models in place, you have your valuation, I mean FCFE, SCFF models that you have created as a group, or you have done your regression model for your beta, etc. You can actually use the exact same model, plug in different figures for your ECA, right? Chances are your ECA is going to um, you have to value a different company, but then the valuation is the same, right? So long as you use the same tools, you can use that same tools to do your ECA. So what we have seen previously is that most groups that do very well for your GPA typically do very well for your ECA because they use the same models, um, maybe different companies, and that's about it, right? And maybe they do some changes here and there. So the trick, I would say, is really to work hard as a group together for your GPA so that you can do well for your ECA. Because your ECA is, again, is a individual, right? So really doing an evaluation individual is not easy, but that's why the body is trying to push you to know how to do it, right? However, they guide you by first allowing it to be done as a group in a GPA, and then later they push you to do it solo in your ECA. Okay, so I hope that will provide you some motivation maybe to work hard on your GPA. Okay, any final words? If not, I think I know it's a Friday, so we will call it a day. Thank you for coming for the Friday class. Yeah, and all the best. Feel free to drop me a message in case you have some doubts. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Have a good weekend. Good night. Pause the recording.